Hello, and welcome back to a discussion of Gotham 1919. Gotham 1919 is a fan-made adaptation of the Batman lore, now set in the 1920s. A time frame that covers World War I, Prohibition, and the Great Depression. Several character backstories are changed to fit in with the actual historical events that took place in this time, and that's what my series covers, the real history used throughout Gotham 1919. If this is your first time hearing about any of this, I recommend my first video on the book, where we introduce the concept better and we cover some of Batman's biggest villains. So if you're wondering why they aren't in this, they're probably in the first part, or they will be covered in the future. Just a quick note, if you want more Gotham 1919 videos, the best way to let me know is by dropping a like, subscribing, and commenting a story you want me to cover. But enough yapping, we've got 9 stories to get through this time, so let's continue a discussion of the real history behind Gotham 1919. I covered Batman's more iconic and best well-known villains in the first part, save for this guy, the Riddler. A villain who's gained fame and notoriety over the past few years thanks to Paul Dano's portrayal in The Batman. And this kinda gave us a more grounded portrayal of the Riddler as a serial killer domestic terrorist. But I'm sure this wasn't your first exposure to the character. The Riddler was created in October of 1948 by Bill Finger and Dick Sprang. What an unfortunate name. And it's basically been in everything Batman since. The Adam West Show, the Super Friends, the Tim Burton movie, Arkham and Telltale games, and the aforementioned Batman movie. He's a staple in the Batman mythos, so of course, he's in Gotham 1919. Something we can discuss now, both his story and the real history used. Boredom is a disease, one with many cures, and Edward Nygma found his in puzzles. They allowed him to further his knowledge while proving his intellectual superiority over people he saw as lessers. This continued into college, where he saw a degree in law. He easily aced his classes, eventually feeling that old creeping feeling of boredom, one his usual puzzle solving could not satiate. So instead of solving puzzles, he created one, by murdering a fellow student and pinning the blame on another. This other student was arrested, and Nygma went through his college year, never being discovered, graduating at the top of his class with a degree in law. This probably happened in the early 1910s, or maybe even late 1800s. The Riddler is older in this version. But for the whole getting away with it, this wasn't uncommon for this time frame. Forensics was not what it is today, and we actually have a story on that later down. But for now, let's move on. Edward continued his life like nothing out of the ordinary had happened. He became one of Gotham City's most acclaimed lawyers, working on a number of high-profile cases that made him incredibly well-known in the community. It was second nature to him, something that should have been cheered, but actually ended up being his downfall, as the monotony of life creeped up on him once again. The days of college hung heavy on Edward's head, but while most people looked back on days of partying, hanging out with friends, and acing finals, Edward thought back to his perfect crime, and the rush and thrill that went along with it. From taking a man's own life, to piecing together the clues that would lead to a wrongful conviction, and in the end, him getting away scot-free tore at him. He wanted to do it again, and so, he did. Beginning in October of 1925, the Gotham City Police Department began to receive typewritten letters on cardstock, each of them signed with a question mark, addressed from the Riddler. The first one read as follows: "Give me food, and I will live. Give me water, and I will die. What am I?" The GCPD didn't think much of this, a prank they didn't have time to investigate, something they would come to regret that night, as only with the discovery of a charred corpse in the Pine Barrens did they understand what it was. An answer: fire. Someone was giving hints on how they would kill. This continued for a year and a half, the GCPD getting no cards from the Riddler that all went unsolved despite their own attempts. No. To catch the Riddler, they needed a stronger mind. They needed their own detective, which the newly appointed Commissioner Gordon could work closely with. So when in December of 1926, the GCPD got their final card from the Riddler, stating, "Alive without breath, as cold as death, never thirsty, ever drinking. All in mail, never clinking. Batman knew right away what it was, a fish. The Riddler was going to drown someone, so he and Robin investigated the ports and docks of Gotham, where they came face to face with the man they had been chasing for years, the Riddler. He had a man chained to cinder blocks, about to throw him into Gotham Harbor. The Riddler didn't fight, he was surrendering to the pair. This was never about a fight, it was about his puzzle, a puzzle the dynamic duo solved. He delivered a full confession to the 16 murders he had committed, including the one in college he had framed. So I think it's pretty clear where the inspiration for this Riddler came from, the Zodiac Killer. A story I'm sure you're familiar with, so I'll do a quick summary. Beginning on August 1st, 1969, newspapers across California received strange letters, confessing to the murder of several people. And with each letter, complex puzzles and symbols were included, sparking a case that has never been solved. But this took place in the 70s, 40 years after the Riddler story. Is there anything similar to it from that time frame? Well, Jack the Ripper took place 40 years before the Riddler story, which of course was another serial killer sending in letters to the police taunting them. And of course, he was never caught. But was there something that took place in his time frame? The closest thing we have was the Axeman in New Orleans. Between 1918 and 1919, 6 people were murdered in New Orleans. And a week post-mortem, a newspaper in the city received a letter stating, "I am very fond of jazz music, and I swear by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose home a jazz band is in full swing at the time I had just mentioned." On that night, the streets in New Orleans were filled with jazz, and true to the Axeman's words, no one was killed. Okay, we covered serial killers sending in letters to the police. We have a final narrative beat to cover with some real history. 16 years have gone by, when Edward Nygma gets a visit at Blackgate Prison. He goes to see who it is, and it's a masked man, but it's not Batman. Edward didn't know it, but Bruce had already hung up his cow, and has passed the responsibility of Batman to John Paul Valley, Azrael. But while he was handling the gangsters and villains in Gotham, someone took over the investigative side of it. The man standing before Edward, Red Wing, Tim Drake, the third Robin. Several serial killers were active in Gotham. Names like Pig, Calendar Man, and Zaz were all targets of Red Wing. But to track down a serial killer, he enlisted the help of a serial killer, listing the details of each target to Edward, picking his brain behind the identity of each killer. This was the first known instance of profile building being used in forensics, and it's thanks to his help that they were apprehended. The development of this new line of thinking remained in the mind of Drake, who figured he could make a real difference for the entire country, not just Gotham. So soon after the apprehension of the 3 serial killers, he hangs up his own cow, and joins the newly blossoming FBI, recently renamed from the Bureau of Investigation. If you remember back to the Batman entry, they spent a lot of manpower in discovering who he was, but now here one of his Robins was, making me wonder if Tim Drake went in confessing who he was, but that's not super important. What is that Tim Drake helps develop a lot of the new forensic technology used by the FBI. I was going to cover all of this, history of the FBI and forensic science and how it ties in with Tim Drake, but the entry became longer and longer and longer, and I kind of want to move on from this. But if Tim's full story is something that interests you, for sure let me know and I'll cover him in a part 3. What you've seen at Gotham 1919 could be summarized in a single word: grounded. Everything you've seen so far is believable, like it really could have happened. And this is a big part of Batman's appeal as a whole. He's a grounded hero. He fights mobsters, not aliens. But while this as a whole is true, Batman is a comic book character, and he does fight comic book enemies. He has a whole side of his rogues gallery that are fantastical and could not exist in our actual time. And perhaps the most fantastical of them all is Clayface. I mean, just look at him. Stop and think to yourself, how could he fit into Gotham 1919 and what would he look like? It would have been incredibly easy to shy away from these fantastical villains and stick more to the grounded characters. But the creator of Gotham 1919 embraced the wackiness of them and adapted them into a way that makes perfect sense, using both the blend of the character's actual history and our real-world history. We cover a lot of them in this video, and we're starting with Clayface. Clayface is a character who has changed drastically since his first introduction. But for now, I'll cover the one you're used to, Basil Karlo. This has always been the name of Clayface, with his first appearance in June of 1940. But this guy is different, we'll come back to him. The modern Clayface, in terms of abilities, was first introduced in the 50s. His name was Matthew Hagen, and experienced a change to his molecular structure, turning his body into clay, giving him his typical shape-shifting powers. But Matthew Hagen isn't important right now. For now, just know when Clayface was introduced, he was named Basil Karlo, but didn't have any of the usual powers Basil Karlo Clayface has. Alright, we've got a big, shape-shifting clay monster. How does that fit in with the grounded 1920s world of Gotham 1919? Theater was a dying medium. As the movie industry exploded through the early 1920s, less people were showing up at the stage, and more were showing up at the screen. At first, these shows were traveling tents with screens, but the first permanent movie theater opened in 1896 in New Orleans, and from there, they exploded across the country, killing off stage play. But just because theater was a dying medium, did not mean it wasn't a lucrative business, and Basil Karlo was still riding that wave, a wave that would crash very soon. He got his start in theater from a young age, quickly gaining fame for his talents on the stage, and pretty soon, every production company in Gotham was lining up to hire him. Karlo's most famous show was a play called Dread Castle, a horror play where he portrayed the lead villain, a serial killer called the Terror. Newspapers at this time raved over his performance, highlighting how unsettling that such a handsome man could play a villain so wicked. With this newfound love came the thrills of such a position. Late night parties, women all wanting a piece of him, and most paramount amongst these, copious amounts of alcohol consumption. Karlo had found his vice. He started showing up the set drunk, and became insanely belligerent to his co-stars and production teams, which industry leaders took notice of, and they began to consider a separation of Karlo from their shows. The name Basil Karlo soon turned from a household beloved career-furthering title into one of a literal nightmare, and changes on the horizon would do nothing to help this. Karlo took note of the changes in his industry. Each night, less and less seats were filled as they were all turning their attention to the silver screen. To combat this creeping feeling of a dead career, Karlo continued to drown his sorrows. His alcoholism was only getting worse, and an alcoholic was the last thing you wanted to be in the 1920s. As Prohibition was beginning, making Karlo's vice harder to fulfill, he was starting to turn from a general annoyance on set into a verbal and physical abuser, suffering from withdrawals, causing the last few remaining theater companies to blacklist Basil from their productions. An actor falling from grace is a common thing to see nowadays, but it's nothing new. A story very similar to Basil Karlo was what happened to Roscoe Arbuckle. Arbuckle got his start on stage plays before transitioning into silent films, rising in prominence through the early 1910s into the 1920s. However, this is not why Arbuckle is known today. Today, he is remembered for his 3 trials, which he was a defendant. Between November of 1921 and April of 1922, 3 trials were held against him, alleging that he had sexually assaulted and murdered a fellow actress named Virginia Rapp. The first 2 trials were dismissed because of a hung jury, and the third one acquitted him. However, due to his scandal, he was pretty much blacklisted from the industry and appeared sparingly in films for the rest of his life. The story of Roscoe Arbuckle is often said to be Hollywood's first real scandal. The rage felt in Karlo was nothing up until now. The final straw, the one that broke the camel's back, was the news that Dread Castle was being remade. But not as a stage play, as an actual film production, and the former lead and villain was never contacted to reprise his role. The news hit him hard, and drove Karlo further down the depressive spiral. One night, he was alone, drinking, like any other night. But he reflected on his life, the rise of his prominence on stage, to his decline into a reclusive alcoholic failure. This filled him full of rage that finally boiled over. If he couldn't be a star on the stage, no one could. He went to his old theater, canisters of gasoline in hand. He was gonna burn it to the ground, killing the cast, crew, audience, and himself. But someone caught wind of the Basil Karlo case, the Batman. The world's greatest detective knew he was gonna do something, and was waiting at the theater. He saw Karlo with his canister, and a fight broke out that ended in the spillage of gasoline over the man, and a single spark was all it took. Basil was the only one set on fire that night, and as he crashed down onto the stage, Batman evacuated the theater before it all came crashing down. Basil's body was recovered, and by some miracle, he was alive. He spent the next few months in a coma, but would wake up, getting to see what he did to himself, looking more like a walking pile of clay than man. The once dashing Basil Karlo was killed in that fire, and Clayface was born from the ashes. So like I said, a major departure from the usual Clayface story and identity, or is it? Because this is what Basil Karlo actually was at first, an actor who loses prominence and has his famous movie remade, without him in it. He becomes a serial killer and tracks down the crew behind the film, and is stopped by Batman. So to get Clayface in Gotham 1919 in a way that fit, the creators looked back towards the character's origins, adapting them for the 1920 era. And I think it's a great choice. And I want to know what you think about not just Clayface, but all the fantastical, unrealistic villains and how they're changed to fit into Gotham 1919. We're covering an additional 4 this video, and 1 is up next. Like we said, we're covering another villain of Batman who could not exist in our real world, that being Poison Ivy. She's a little bit newer, first debuting in June of 1966, and she was created by Robert Kanigher and Carmine Infantino. The typical origin for Poison Ivy is that she grows up wealthy, attends college in a study for something plant-based, before being seduced by her professor who later experiments on her, giving her an immunity to poisons while gaining control over botany. This origin is adapted to Gotham 1919 with some slight tweaks to make it believable and different, and we have some real history sprinkled in, so let's cover that all now. Like many immigrants headed for America, the Ivy family saw Gotham City as an opportunity for a new life. So after immigrating there from England, getting themselves established with a well-off business, and just generally settling into the city, they decided to have a child, later giving birth to a daughter they named Pamela. So in the book, it states that the Ivies are European, but they never list a specific country. I chose England myself because the surname Ivy comes from England and Ireland. And I mean, she also has red hair, which is stereotypically an Irish thing, so maybe she's from there. But anyways, not super important, let's continue. Growing up with a more progressive family, Ivy was encouraged to further her passions, and she took an interest in all things fauna, working in her family's garden every spring season. As she got older, she was encouraged by her family to further her education by going to college. She was accepted into Gotham University, and her field of study was obvious: botany. At this time in history, a woman furthering her education was not unheard of, but it also wasn't insanely commonplace. But keep in mind from the first part, Gotham was said to be a city of progress, so I imagine she didn't have as hard of a time getting accepted here as she would have in another city. But once in college, Pamela easily rose to the top of her class, having been around plants her entire life, making coursework second nature. Her rise was noticed by the men in her class, easily falling for her looks and her brains, but none of these guys had her attention. Her professor did. The shared interest in all things floral naturally pulled them together. Beyond that of a typical teacher-student relationship, they began an affair. And it didn't take long for her professor, Dr. Jason Woodrow, to become obsessed with her. However, this forbidden love wouldn't stay between them for long, as it soon leaked to other campus officials. To save his own profession, Dr. Woodrow pitted the blame on Ivy, claiming she had came on to him, and all the relations were advanced by her. Thanks to his position of authority and his lies, Pamela was expelled from campus, while Jason returned to work. The news of her affair and expulsion reached her family, who were disgusted with her, kicking her out of the house. Now poor and alone in the streets of Gotham, Pamela promised herself to never become a victim again. Months after being expelled, Pamela returned to Gotham University with one man in her sights, her former professor. He would be lying to himself if he said he didn't miss Pamela, so after briefly catching up, he gave in to old desires, pledging to meet her that night at a nearby hotel. Night would soon come, and the pair reunited after months of being apart. He pulled him to a kiss, to which Pamela reciprocated, but as he pulled away, he began to aspirate, clutching at his throat before crashing to the ground, face rapidly turning blue. The last thing he saw was her scowl as he succumbed to the poison she had applied on her lips. Being an expert in all things floral allowed her to know exactly what plants should not be ingested. and said plants were blended into a poison she carried in a tube of lipstick, which was subtle enough to apply without drawing attention. So, a couple things. First of all, yes, that's something Poison Ivy is known for in the comics. She has her kiss that rather hypnotizes or poisons the person she kisses. But that's a comic book. We're in a grounded world now. So to continue, if her lipstick is poisonous, shouldn't her own application kill her if kissing someone else kills them? Well, it is possible she built up an immunity to her own poison, which is the practice of Mithridatism, coming from Mithridates V, who was assassinated through a poisoning. His son, Mithridates VI, feared the same fate, so he began to ingest small amounts of poison on a daily basis, building up an immunity. Modern studies paint Mithridatism as a mostly useless and dangerous practice, but I said mostly, not entirely. The most basic example of modern Mithridatism is alcohol consumption. As with the more alcohol you drink over the years, the harder it becomes to get drunk. But for like actual lethal poisons, it gets a little more complex. Beginning with heavy metal poison, stuff like lead and mercury, that stuff accumulates in the body, therefore making little doses add up to a lethal dose. However, the most effective modern-day use of Mithridatism surrounds snake poison. In the 1960s, a US Army veteran named Herschel Flowers began injecting himself with snake venom to turn his blood into an anti-venom for American soldiers in the jungles of Vietnam. So it is possible to build up an immunity to snake venom, but Ivy's poison is said to be a plant-based. So, is there a plant-based poison she would be able to make a lipstick out of that she could gain an immunity to? Well, maybe cyanide. Cyanide is found in several seeds of plants, most notably apples, but enough to poison a human? It would take a lot. But if there's someone smarter than me out there, maybe I'll have some assassins in my audience, feel free to chime in. We just have one quick narrative beat to get through before we move on. Ivy didn't stop with her professor. She continued to exploit men using her good looks to get whatever she wanted, leaving them all with a less than happy ending. With every death, the authorities discovered a French postcard left behind featuring a nude, red-haired woman, which caught the eye of the press, beginning the media's obsession over this mysterious killer. French postcards were mass-produced pictures printed on cardstock that featured nude depictions of people. They were made primarily in, get this, France, but they weren't made for mail, they were made for tourists. So I don't know how one ended up in New Jersey, but anyways, after Batman investigated the string of murders, it wasn't hard to find the perpetrator. Starting with the murder of the professor, and knowing he was looking for a woman, it didn't take long to trace back to Ivy. She went on trial, where her looks continued to gain her favor in the eyes of the press. It's here where she got her nickname, Poison Ivy. So overall, not a huge entry in the book, but it was still pretty good nonetheless. We've got 6 more stories to get through for this video. And since we just covered Poison Ivy, it's only fitting we cover Harley Quinn, as these characters have become inseparable in recent years. Did you know Harley Quinn wasn't a comic character at first? Alright, I'm sure you did, but for those who don't, she first debuted in the animated series, an episode that came out on September 11th, 1992. Since then, she's been a staple in the Batman mythos. While today, you may associate the name Tara Strong or Margot Robbie with Harley Quinn, when she was created, she was voiced by Arlene Sorkin. Sorkin was chosen by Paul Dini, one of Harley Quinn's co-creators, and he chose her for a specific reason, as Sorkin had previously played a clown character in a dream sequence for Days of Our Lives.
I'm on at the roll, let's get it!
And Denny knew her from college, so he was the obvious choice to voice Harley. She was actually only supposed to be in one episode, but her immense popularity allowed her to expand into the pop culture figurehead she is today. I'm sure you know her origin, so I'm going to quickly run through it. She works at Arkham Asylum as a psychiatrist, and she begins to work with the Joker, who she falls in love with. After months of brainwashing, she breaks him out and continues their relationship. Some aspects of that are changed for Gotham 1919, so let's cover that now. Arlene Frances Quinzel lived in Gotham City with her abusive father, who made her work to fuel his habits. She wasn't given much of a chance for a furthered education, so she took the first job she could get, a custodian at Arkham Asylum, a place she hated. She had to clean that awful hellhole from top to bottom every night, but work would follow her home every night, in the forms of tormented screams that filled every corner of the stone-cold walls. At home, her nightmare would be furthered from the drunken beatings of her father. Something had to change, and it soon would. Hush whispers of every Arkham staff always talked about the darkest cell at the far corner of Arkham, the one that held the Joker. Tales of his exploits were the regular gossip, and Harley fed into it, but she wanted to know more. So, she began to speak with him, a decision that forever changed her life. For 16 months, Harley would sneak away to talk to the Joker, striking up a relationship in this time. She believed the man was misunderstood, not the demon the other staff spoke of. Through these whispered conversations and secret love notes, she developed somewhat of an obsession with the Joker. An obsession that spilled over into a breakout. She got him out of Arkham, and their first stop, Harley's house. The Joker knew about her and her father's relationship, and it was time for Harley to face her fear. So the Joker gave her a simple command: kill him, and she happily obliged. Now standing in her apartment over her father's body, Joker and Harley decided it was time to leave Gotham. But before they did, she got a makeover, looking more like the Joker, and I love her design in this. She looks exactly like a clown from this era. It's great. After this, they begin a cross-country crime spree rivaling that of Bonnie and Clyde, or maybe Bonnie and Clyde rivaled them because they were active between 1932 and 34. And Joker and Harley happened in like the mid-1920s, but regardless, they're basically the stand-in for the duo in this book, going on a cross-country crime spree, robbing banks, murdering people, and, I don't know, jaywalking. However, this was all a game to the Joker, and Gotham City is where he wanted to be, but the duo's return had to be marked by something huge. The murder of Jason Todd was the point of no return. Before, Harley had seen how violent the man could be, but once she saw this evil unleashed onto a child, she began to consider her life. This reconsideration continued throughout the years, made stronger by the constant abuse the Joker personally dished out. And this time, she also met Pamela Ivy, who gave her the strength to go to the police. She turned herself into the GCPD, beginning a case against the Joker, confessing to the own murder of her father in the process. Of course, she was arrested, but was given a deal that she would testify against the Joker, reducing her sentence. It's in this time where she became a media sensation, not just in the city, state, or county, but the globe. It's said she served as the inspiration for many female characters of this time, most notably that of Betty Boop, Helen Kane, and Clara Bow. So I'm sure you know at least one of those names, that being Betty Boop. But there's actually a triangle, or maybe just an angle, connecting all three of them. First of all, Betty Boop was created on August 9th, 1930. But her first design was that of an anthropoodle, so furries have always been with us. Anyways, her human design would come out a year later, and she was based off the way flappers would dress in the 1920s. So it makes sense in this universe for her design to come from Harley. But we can now discuss Helen Kane and Clara Bow, two actresses at this time. Kane actually entered in a lawsuit against the creators of Betty Boop, claiming her likeness was used in the design, and the trial ended in the creators' favor. The creators did admit to using Clara Bow's style in the character, but in Gotham, Harley inspires all three of them. But let's finish up. After her media circus show was over, she was told she had one last thing to do to secure freedom: serve with Task Force X, a special operations team about to be deployed into France. But that is a story for another day. In June of 1970, the writers at DC needed a new villain for Batman, and they were stumped on what to create. Then some genius was staring at the name Batman before he announced he had it, flipping the words to create Man-Bat. So I wrote that intro as a joke, but it turns out that's exactly what happened. Anyways, Man-Bat was created by Frank Robbins, Neil Adams, and Julius Schwartz, and first came out in June of 1970. His origin is practically the same, so I don't see a point restating it, so let's just dive right into his Gotham 1919 story. Beginning in 1910, the Soviet scientist Ilya Ivanov began his controversial experiments. In the late 1800s, Ilya made a name for himself by practicing artificial insemination for horse breeding, allowing him to impregnate 500 mares compared to a usual 20 to 30 through natural insemination. Because of this, Ilya was sought out by several horse breeders from across the world to get his assistance with their own horses, and this would begin his interest in the practice. But he wanted to take it a step up from horse breeding. He wanted to create an ape-human hybrid. He first revealed this interest in 1910, while attending a presentation featuring the World Congress of Zoologists, which was a conference held in Graz, Austria. It wouldn't be until the 1920s where he began his practice by artificially inseminating 3 chimpanzees, which did not result in a pregnancy. He attempted one last time in 1929, which resulted in a failure. News of this would reach the United States government, who wanted to further the research, and they had just the right scientist to do so, Dr. Kirk Langstrom. Langstrom had already made a name for himself through his own studies on animal DNA, but when the United States government, under the orders of President Franklin Roosevelt, came knocking at his door with grant money, he happily accepted it. The United States wanted to pick up where Ilya left off, and wanted to solve the question of cross-animal breeding. However, Langstrom was making very little progress, running into the same issues Ilya faced. But Kirk had his own problem on the horizon, his hearing. He was losing it, and he decided to shift his focus to bat DNA. He thought the secret to hearing loss was in bats, thanks to their advanced ears. But this wasn't what the American government wanted, and they would soon arrive at Kirk's lab. Threats were made, telling him this program was going nowhere, and human trials would need to begin. However, Kirk believed these trials were way off, but he was practically deaf by this point. So with nothing left to lose, he began human trials on himself. At first, nothing changed. Kirk figured it was over, and his years of research were a waste of time. But he only wishes that was true, because the bad DNA soon took to his own, and his hearing was fixed, but that's not where the changes ended. Slowly, his body became more gnarled, growing in height, but also facing extreme weight loss across his entire body. Then his ears began to grow in length, turning into points at the end. He was no longer Dr. Kirk Langstrom. Time was up. The United States government arrived at Langstrom's lab to pack it up, unsatisfied with his progress. But as they opened the door, allowing light to creep in, a horrid screech nearly made them fall over. Once inside, they saw the source of what made the noise. It was some type of creature, backing away from the light, headed into the corner. The agents were terrified and didn't know what to do, but they did manage to detain the creature. Afterwards, they searched Langstrom's lab to figure out what the hell happened here, and the final entry from his journal gave them their answer. That was Dr. Langstrom. He started human trials, and they worked, regrettably so. Langstrom was sent to Blackgate Prison, a specially built jail for high-profile criminals, before they took every file pertaining to his research, and, on the way out, the building was set on fire. To the public, Dr. Kirk Langstrom was killed in this fire, but secretly, he was thrown into the darkest corner of a forgotten prison, left there to rot, with his secrets being stashed away behind the highest level of clearance. With such an expansive and unique rogues gallery, it's hard to pick out a favorite Batman villain. Or at least, it might be hard for you, because I have my favorite, and it's Mr. Freeze. My love for Mr. Freeze began with Arkham City. He's one of my favorite boss fights in any video game, and I remember as a kid intentionally dying to him just so I could replay it. My love continued for him through his animated series appearance and the comics, maybe not the New 52 Mr. Freeze, Jesus Christ, but yes, Mr. Freeze is my favorite Batman villain. While sympathetic villains may be too commonplace today, Mr. Freeze is the perfect example of how to do one right, because he's not really a villain. His whole goal surrounds the safety of his wife, but once again, his origin is adapted for Gotham 1919, and I don't feel like saying it twice, so we'll cover it now. While most immigrants coming into America came from Germany, Italy, and Ireland, there is also a sizable amount of people coming from Austria, with 2.1 million people moving here between 1901 and 1910. And these numbers would slow down in the next few years, with only 20,000 coming between 1919 and 1924. However, during one of these immigration waves, renowned scientist Victor Freeze moved to Gotham City. He was coming to the land of opportunity with one main goal: furthering his research into cryogenics. However, Freeze never came to America seeking love, but sometimes it seeks you. And it sought Victor in the form of Nora. It wouldn't take long for the two to get married, and it wouldn't take much longer for Victor to get a job offer from GothCorp, the second largest technology company in Gotham City, only falling behind Wayne Enterprises. But They were looking to surpass them, and Victor was just the man they needed, funding his research into cryogenics. Cryogenics is basically the study of how extreme cold temperatures can be applied, and a lot of the studies done involve healthcare applications. This dates back to the Egyptians, who used cold compresses to treat inflammations and headaches. But a real breakthrough in the field was made in 1877. This year, oxygen was cooled to the point of reaching a liquid, which gave way to the development of refrigerators. But in 1920, it reached clinical use, mostly being used in skincare applications such as the freezing of warts. But it's my assumption that this, along with technological applications, was what Victor was hired to research. With the love of his life and his research being funded, giving him a job at a massive company in a developing city, life couldn't get much better for Victor. But it could get worse. Not long after starting at GothCorp, Nora was diagnosed with an incurable illness, which is standard for Mr. Freeze's story. But in doing research, I've seen the actual disease has changed a lot. In the New 52, it was stated to be a heart disease. In the Arkham Origins DLC, it's said to be Huntington's chorea. And across a lot of DC media, it's a disease called McGregor syndrome that kills her. This was used in the Batman and Robin movie, and both the Arrow and Flash TV show, being a disease contracted from extensive drug abuse. The actual disease in the book is never stated, but I'll quickly summarize Huntington's disease. It makes the most sense. It's an incurable brain degeneration disease that is mostly hereditary, and once symptoms first arise, the patient usually lives for about 15 years afterwards. While not stated in the book, I believe this is what Nora has. She wouldn't respond to any treatment given, only seeming to decline. And Victor began to wonder if the answer was in his research. Like we said in the 1920s, cryostasis was mostly being used for medical treatment. So behind the back of GothCorp officials, Victor began to embezzle funds for research into Nora's disease and for a cure. But no progress was being made, and Nora was getting worse, and Victor was getting desperate. He was also getting no further with his own work, which was upsetting the GothCorp officials. During an internal audit, they found that Victor was embezzling money. Now ready to forcibly remove the scientist from their lab, they go to confront him. Victor didn't want to leave. He felt like he was getting closer, but GothCorp was done with him and began to forcibly remove the man. But he fought back, and a struggle rose, and Victor was injured. His entire body was dunked in the sub-zero material he was working with. The staff were terrified, fleeing from the building. Victor was alive, barely, but when he would try and leave the building, his body would heat up to a near paralyzing fever. He had to construct a suit to keep his temperature regulated, and I know it's redundant to say, but I love his design. And this closely resembles what Mr. Freeze looked like in his first comic. Maybe not the collars, but this same design has been adapted into the animated series, and once again here in Gotham 1919. After his suit was created and he could safely leave, he went to find his wife. But in the meantime of the confrontation and his suit construction, she unfortunately succumbed to her illness. Victor was mad, beyond mad, entering a blind rage, beginning to strike out against the city, hunting down any GothCorp executive he could find. Batman was a little out of his league against this guy, and he was an immediate spectacle for anyone to watch. Gotham was an exciting city, but having an armored man going around freezing cars, this was something new entirely, and Batman would require help from the entire Bat family to bring down Mr. Freeze. I am so glad they didn't try and ground Mr. Freeze too hard in this. Like I think I said last video, everything in this book is made to be insanely believable, so I really don't mind if they sprinkle in a bit of science fiction, because freeze rays and refrigerated suits don't exist. Or do they? With the freeze ray, scientists are actively working on using plasma to power one. And some scientists in my audience will think, wait a minute, plasma is hot, like insanely hot, like core of the sun hot. Well, actually, it is. But not when it first strikes the surface. It cools it down, briefly. So scientists are working on that property to create a full-fledged ray gun for use in spaceflight. As for the suit, according to this random DC website, it's said the suit uses highly concentrated chlorofluorocarbons to keep it cool, which are used for cooling before being outlawed for being harmful. But no, as of today, there is no walking refrigerator suit to keep a man below sub-zero temperatures, but who cares? Let's move on. Batman probably has the best rogues gallery of any comic book character, top 3 for sure, and I like most of his villains, but I said most, not all. Because I don't know, man, I really never liked the Mad Hatter. My biggest exposure to him was through the Arkham games. He was alright in City, kind of annoying in Origins, and really annoying in Night. But I don't know, I just never really liked him, and I'm pretty neutral, I guess you can say, of him in Gotham 1919. I will say, he's pretty different from what the standard DC recipe does, tying him into a huge DC character in the book, but you'll see what I mean, beginning now. It was a night like any other. Batman was stopping the odd mugger that called Gotham streets and alleys at night home. He was returning back to his Batmobile when he saw a shadow near it. Upon getting closer, he realized it was a young man with a tire iron, attempting to remove the Batmobile's tires. He dropped the iron in fear, and Batman was conflicted with what to do. But upon reflection, he thought about Dick Grayson, his last Robin who had previously left him for his own ventures. He needed a new sidekick, and this young man needed guidance. So within months of meeting, Batman had his new Robin, Jason Todd, who was about to help him take down one of Gotham City's largest crime rings. Bruce didn't need to know who was behind the scenes of this attempted carjacking. He already knew, and Jason confirmed it, being the Mad Hatter. Someone Batman already had run-ins with. If Gotham City's criminals were in a caste system, the Mad Hatter would be the lowest amongst them. He ran a network of runaway children, grooming them into working for him as thieves, being sent out in the night to get anything they could get a hold of. It was like this for years, and every time Jervis Tech would be arrested, he would be right back out on the streets, as there was no shortage of runaway children he could build a new army with. As for the actual man himself, little was known to him besides his name, Jervis Tech. He was a shorter man, kinda despondent, being seen in ratty, torn-up clothes, living in abandoned buildings. Few children knew his actual name, instead referring to him as the Mad Hatter because of his resemblance to the book character of the same name from Alice in Wonderland. Now, of course, the usual Batman villain Mad Hatter has many direct ties to the Alice in Wonderland property. He's usually an obsessive fan with a series, later becoming downright schizophrenic to the point of believing he was the actual Mad Hatter from the book. But in Gotham 1919, the man Jervis Tech has no connection to the property himself, it's just a nickname given to him. The Alice in Wonderland book came out in 1865, which, first of all, holy shit, I didn't know it was that old. And it was insanely popular, with a silent film adaptation coming out in 1903, 1910, and 1915. So children making this comparison just by reading the book does make sense. But back to Gotham 1919. The war fought between the Mad Hatter and the city of Gotham was one of attrition. And this time, he recruited a young boy by the name of Jason Todd, who quickly became one of his top earners and most trusted associates, which is why he was sent to break into the Batmobile. Now working with the Batman, he was ready to stop the Mad Hatter. Being at the top of the Hatter's own caste system meant Jason knew intricate details of exactly how it worked, including common places where they would operate from. One piece of information Robin revealed was the existence of David and Dean Twicer, some of the first and oldest members of the Mad Hatter gang. They were basically the next step down from the Hatter himself, serving as the muscle of the operation, used to keep the other children in line. Because of this, they earned their own nicknames of Tweedledee and Tweedledum, much to their dismay. By the time Jason and Bruce were ready to take down the Mad Hatter, they had grown into young men, and were discussing their own plans of criminal activity. That night, when Batman went to the Hatter's hideaway with Jason Todd, debuting his new Robin, he realized the Hatter and D brothers were not there. But who was there was a room filled with scared children. This made him reflect. Every one of these pairs of eyes looking at him had a story, whether they were runaways, homeless, or, much like himself, orphans. If circumstances were different, Bruce could have been one of these kids, forced to work with a lowly thief just to survive. Something had to change, beginning right now as the Batman. He stood as a symbol of hope, letting the children know everything would be alright. But, as Bruce Wayne, future philanthropic endeavors would be needed made for this system that allowed armies of children to be set out into the street. But for now, he had to find the Hatter. The Mad Hatter and D brothers got wind that Batman was on his way, and knowing what would be coming, a beatdown followed by imprisonment, they fled. As they maneuvered through the Gotham City sewers, Jervis was reassuring them, letting them know that he already had plans to win back another army, like all the other times before this. But this time, it was different. As the three made their way further down, the two brothers stopped, as did Jervis. With a knowing look, first at each other, then towards their adopted father, they opened fire, killing the Mad Hatter as he fell into the city's sewer drain tunnels, a fitting end for such a man. So first of all, there's a few things I want to say about the Mad Hatter before we move on. Beginning with Jason Todd. He has no connection to Jervis Tech in the comics, but Jason is usually a runaway kid who tries to break into the Batmobile, where he meets Batman, so I like that they adapted this story in with the Mad Hatters. One change I don't really like is how they don't give him his own personal connection to Alice in Wonderland. That's his whole shtick, and they take it away. I got a simple fix for that, but we'll come back later, because there's a piece of real history I wish they tied into the book, with that being Mad Hatter Syndrome. The actual scientific name is erytheism, which is a neurological disorder that comes from mercury poisoning. But how does the Mad Hatter part tie in? Well, in the late 1800s, the production of gentlemen's hats involved mercury. This did lead to problems in Europe, causing mercury to be banned in the production of hats. But in the United States, this wouldn't be stopped until 1941, well after the book. Plus, it's stated that the Mad Hatter in the book wears basically whatever he can find, so it's possible he finds a dumpster hat, wears it, and begins to mentally deteriorate from mercury poisoning. So what if this happened, combined with his child army calling him the Mad Hatter, makes the man believe he is the Mad Hatter like in typical DC fashion. A pretty small change, but one I believe makes perfect sense and fits really well. But as always, let me know what you think. Alright, we've covered the man made of clay, the half-bat, half-man, and the walking refrigerator. So now we ask, how does Gotham 1990 make a 10-foot-tall bipedal crocodile man realistic? Would you believe me if I told you this one is the most realistic? You don't have to stretch your imagination for any of this. The creators of Gotham 1919 took his exact origin and mixed it with a real, actual thing that happened. Is that getting redundant to say? I don't know, maybe. Let's just cover him. The summer of 1929 was a perilous time for Batman. Still reeling from the death of Jason Todd, the Robin he lost mere months ago, he had a new problem pop up on his radar. The circus came to Gotham, which was the last thing Circus City needed. They set up on the outskirts of the city, and had the typical shows of the time, magicians performing illusion acts, tents featuring far-off exotic animals, and of course, the freak show. These things were huge in the late 1800s and first half of the 1900s, where people with physical disabilities or just differences were touted on stage for the quote-unquote normal people to look at with amusement. And the circus that came to Gotham was already well known for their own showing of freaks, including their headliner, the Killer Croc. Waylon Jones was born with a rare skin condition called ichthyosis vulgaris, which is a real disease that gives people dry and scaly skin, giving them a reptilian-like appearance. And Waylon was born with this disease. At a very young age, his family sold him to a traveling sideshow, where he immediately became part of their lineups of freaks. He was given the title of Alligator Boy, and became a marvel for all to watch. But as Waylon got older and bigger, Alligator Boy did not suit him anymore, and he would soon be given the title of the Killer Croc. Not long after the circus, and by extension, the Killer Croc, showed up in Gotham, people began to go missing. It wouldn't take the world's greatest detective to connect the two, and Batman would begin to investigate the circus. He started by looking into what cities they had traveled to previously, sending his Bat family there to investigate. After their investigation was completed, they returned with what they had found. In every city the circus had been in, people were vanishing soon after their arrival. Also, the disappearances all fit the same motive. They were all female, 20s and 30s, with their last known location being filling stations, all going missing the same day the circus would leave the town. Bruce knew the circus would be leaving soon, so he'd have to act fast. Checking a map of the city, he saw there were two near where the circus was set up, so he went to one and Nightwing went to the other, and he was the unlucky one, because he would soon see a young woman there who was quickly targeted by the Killer Croc. Nightwing intervened, and the two began to fight. In the previous, Robin learned exactly why this guy was called the Killer Croc. He was getting beat hard, blow after blow. The boy wonder began to fade. But he thought about Jason, and the more he did, the madder he got. Using this newfound burst of anger-fueled adrenaline, he managed to get the upper hand on Waylon, apprehending him before calling in both the GCPD and Batman. Waylon was arrested, being sent to Blackgate Prison, becoming one of the island's most dangerous prisoners. Killer Croc again is a pretty short entry, but there is a real-life story the creators of Gotham 1919 pulled him from, that being the Lobster Boy. Real name Grady Stiles. He was born in 1937 with a genetic condition called ectrodyle, which made his fingers fuse together, giving his hands the appearance of claws. Stiles was forced into the family show at age 7, as his father had the same condition. Stiles later himself had 4 children, and 2 of them had these same conditions. So they began to call themselves the Lobster family, traveling the country. Stiles would soon fall heavily into alcoholism, but this was the least of his plights, as his daughter would soon marry, and he didn't approve of the man. So he shot him, killing him on the eve of their wedding. He openly confessed to the murder and would spend the rest of his life in prison, passing away in November of 1992. Overall, a great and believable entry. I see a lot of people wanting Killer Croc in the Matt Reeves universe, but he has came out and said they won't do unrealistic villains. But if they wanted to do Killer Croc, this is a great route to take to make him realistic. History is defined by names that inspire confidence, doubt, worry, and everything in between. But few names inspire fear like that of the Condiment King. He stands as a pariah beside the most dangerous of Batman villains, and I am confident you've heard his name, but you probably don't know his story. Like Harley Quinn, he was created for the animated series and later made the jump to comics. In the show, he was a comedian who mocked the Joker, so he kidnapped him, brainwashing him into acting like a fool. His whole line of attack is spraying ketchup and mustard, so unless you're a tasty ballpark Frank or like allergic, I think you're good. So yes, the Condiment King is a big joke, usually the punchline when you ask your fat friend who should be the next villain in the movies and they think they're funny, coming off saying, the Condiment King. But the creators of Gotham 1919 looked past all the ridicule and mockery and made the Condiment King a serious and real threat, which is what we can discuss now as our last entry for this video. People deserve to feel safe, especially when they're in their own homes. That's why, when in the summer of 1930, GCPD officers found several people dead in their homes, they realized they had a serious problem on their hands. The absence of blunt force trauma, gunshot wounds, or any other visible signs of damage led the officers to believe that these deaths were at the hands of a poisoning. Over the next few days, more people would be found, dead in the same manner as the first. And then, a letter would be sent to a local company called the Condiment King. It was someone taking responsibility for these deaths, claiming they had poisoned products coming out of their warehouses, and would poison more if their demands would not be met. And the letter was mockingly addressed from the Condiment King. Of course, these messages were passed on to the GCPD, seeing the similarities to the Riddler case, which was initially ignored. But this time, they were taken seriously, so an investigation was launched. The investigation started internally, looking towards all employees of the company, conducting interviews to see what people thought. And a name continued to pop up as a concern, Mitchell Mayo, the head of quality control, which first of all, what a stupid name. That is what he's typically named, but come on man, your last name is Mayo, and you work with condiments, what a miserable life this guy must have lived. And I don't blame him for poisoning people, I'd probably do the same if my last name was Mayo. Alright, whatever, we're moving on. It was him poisoning the bottles, that is what the investigation revealed. Mitchell would be arrested by the GCPD, where he would reveal his motives. He saw his company treat workers, and by extension, himself, awful. He wanted a legacy beyond that of a quality control expert, and attempted to gain his own legacy and a ransom through his scheme. In some way, he accomplished his goal. With 7 people now dead, people would always associate the name Condiment King with tainted product. And, while not stated, I imagine they'd go out of business soon after. So the creators of Gotham 1919 did it. They turned the Condiment King into an actual threat. Because think about how scary that is. How much of our food is touched by human hands, and any one of them could slip in whatever they wanted. And then you eat it and you're dead. As dangerous as that sounds, I couldn't find a case of someone intentionally poisoning food meant for mass consumption, but if you know of a case, please let me know. However, As dangerous and nasty as food production is now, it was worse, and changed in the early 1900s. This man is Upton Sinclair, and in 1904, he spent 2 months working in the Chicago meatpacking yards to investigate their conditions and what was being sent out. And what he found was very worrying. The story was a work of fiction, but detailed real practices of what was going on. Sawdust, dead rats, and their waste were being included in the mixture of meat being made. Sinclair also described how workers with tuberculosis would cough into the mixture and would sometimes spit blood into it as well. Sinclair intended his book to be about the struggle of immigrant workers, but Americans cared more about their own consumption than worker rights. I aimed for the country's heart, and I instead hit him in the stomach, Upton Sinclair would later say. But it was thanks to the jungle that the Pure Food and Drug Act was passed, and the FDA was created, which all centered around making food production sanitary. This all happened like 20 years before the Condiment King stuff, and one company in massive support of the act was Heinz, another condiment company created in the early 1900s, who I imagine would seize the opportunity to paint the entire company of the Condiment King as an unsanitary and dangerous workplace. And here we are, another 9 stories of Gotham 1919. Once again, this is part 2, and part 1 will be linked both on screen and in the description. I'm ready to do a part 3, and if there's a story you want covered, for sure let me know. I haven't covered people like Catwoman, Maxie Zeus, Ra's al Ghul, Hush, Deathstroke, Bane, Calendar Man, Victor Zsasz, Professor Pig, Azrael, and much, much more. Also, if you want more Gotham 1919, then listen up. The creators, Giant Panda King, are currently in a battle with Warner Bros. Over the next 2 books, The Mascara and Metropolis. And another Gotham 1919 YouTuber, The Batfeed, has created a petition to allow these books to be created. It'll be the top link in the description, and I encourage you all to sign it. But that's all for me today. Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, have a wonderful day.